This episode was made possible by our generous patrons.
Welcome to episode 134 of the Inktofilm podcast, where we read the book
And then see the movie.
I'm James.
And I'm Luke.
And this week, with the help of special guest Caitlin Starling, we discuss Jonathan Demme's 1991 film, The Silence of the Lambs. Our guest this week is Caitlin Starling, a writer of horror-tinged speculative fiction of all flavors. Her first novel, The Luminous Dead, was nominated for a Bram Stoker Award. Caitlin also works in narrative design and has been paid to design body parts. Welcome to the show, Caitlin.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So glad we got to have you on. We had a conversation about this a little while ago, I think at a social or something here in Portland. And you mentioned The Silence of the Lambs as being a project you were interested in coming on to talk about. So I'm curious, why this project?
The easy answer is just that my last name literally is Starling. Although I don't get as many hello Clarice jokes as you would think, or good evening Clarice jokes as you would think. But I was called Agent Starling once at like a day camp when I was 6 and had no idea what that reference was. But the actual reason is that not only did I read the book and watch the movie and love them both when I was younger, but I also have just, had this book. It's been out for a year now, so it hasn't just come out. But The Luminous Dead is in some ways, in TV tropes language, a Hannibal Lecture for most of the book. It's two characters talking to each other, one of whom is quite dangerous and it's a battle of wills between them. And I didn't fully make that connection until I was rewatching last night, but I was like, oh yeah, that's why this seemed like the right fit.
So that's Geyer and M. I just started your book, I think yesterday. I'm definitely several chapters in, loving it. So interesting. This is definitely the kind of book I love to read. Tense, claustrophobic, it's kind of sci-fi tinge, cave diving, super fun. I'm really into it, so no spoilers. But I'm definitely going to be finishing that this week. And I can see the connection that you're making there. I was thinking about that, how a lot of the drama so far, I mean, it's not all the drama, but a lot of the drama has been between these two characters and their friction with each other and their conversations with each other, which is a main thing for this movie and for the book, which we talked about last week.
Yeah.
I love the idea that a story can just be about two characters' wills and their battle for sort of dominance over the other, or maybe sort of just like strategic vying for some sort of goal.
Yeah, there was an element of writing it where I was like, can I actually sustain it over an entire book where it's just these two characters and you're just looking at the evolution and very sometimes subtle, sometimes very large changes in how they relate to each other and what they think of each other, how much they trust each other / need to trust each other.
Right.
At first I wasn't, when I was first drafting it, I was like, we'll see if this can actually last a whole book. But it did. It lasted a 432-page book.
That's funny. And so the connection is just coincidental, though. It sounds like, right? It wasn't like you had Hannibal in the brain or anything like that.
Not consciously. I mean, like I said, did read the books and watch the movie. Read all of the books of the series, including that really bad prequel.
Okay, Hannibal, right? That's the only one I haven't
Hannibal
seen.
Rising.
I haven't seen or read.
That one is special. Turns out Hannibal is a weeaboo, which I was not expecting.
Wait, what does weeaboo mean?
Just a huge Japanese fandom nerd.
Luke, a weeb, dude. You don't know?
I don't know what it means. I've seen it on the internet, and I'm too afraid to ask. I'm like that other meme. I don't know what a weeb is now, and I'm too afraid to ask.
Spoiler if you haven't read Hannibal Rising, but essentially he had his uncle was married to a hot young Japanese woman who Hannibal was obsessed with, and she taught him how to use a katana or something. It was very weird. I thought Hannibal got weird towards the end with the breastfeeding stuff, but yeah, Thomas Harris still had some gas left in him.
I haven't read any of the other books. This is my first Thomas Harris novel I've actually read.
Oh gosh.
I think I started Red Dragon years ago, but I never finished it. But I've seen all the other movies, and I've seen Hannibal the TV series. Have you seen that one?
I haven't seen all of it. I've seen all of season 1 and most of season 2, and then I wasn't keeping up with it, and now I have to go buy it, and I haven't done that yet.
Right, yeah. They need to put it on Netflix or something.
Yeah.
I think it's worth it. I think the later seasons are maybe even better than the first season, and I think season 2 was pretty solid, but it's been a while, so I could have some stuff mixed up. But anyway, that's not what we're covering. We're covering Silence of the Lambs. So you said that you have read the book and seen the film. Do you remember, if you could guess, like when you saw it, and did you see or read it first?
Gosh, I don't remember if I saw or read it first, because I believe it happened very close together. I would assume that means that I watched it first. I think that would have been easier for me to find, because like I said, I was like maybe 11 or 12 or 13. I was really into the Discovery Channel's crime shows at the time. This is before ID Discovery branched off, like just before ID Discovery became a thing. And also I was reading Anne Rice at the time, so it was a nice, like, perfect confluence of true crime and lush, dark writing. The main thing I remember from reading the book was the copy I had, and it was either Silence of the Lambs or Hannibal, and I don't remember which, but it had a preface by Thomas Harris that was talking about his process. I think it was probably Hannibal, because he was responding to the popularity of Silence of the Lambs, where he basically said that Hannibal Lecter just lived in his head and would chime in with random stuff all the time, and occasionally it would turn into a story and he'd write it down. And I remember being very infatuated with that idea and thinking that was like, okay, that's the proof that a character is fully, a character, that they seem like a real person. Although I think I also was a bit like, okay, dude, maybe take a step back.
Do your characters speak to you in that way now that you are the published author?
Not directly. It's not like they're talking to me.
Yeah.
I do, if anything, I would say it's closer to like woo-woo channeling, in the sense that if I'm in the zone, I don't tend to consciously think, what would this character do now? It tends to just flow, and then if it feels wrong, I just back up and redo it. And if it keeps feeling wrong like 3 or 4 times, I like get it into my forebrain and actually think it through logically and try and fix it that way. But most of the time, it just kind of happens naturally. And if it's not, that means that the book's not ready. So it's kind of in the middle there.
Okay, yeah, I like that. So I have a little bit of a personal connection to this film in a roundabout way too. Not only is it a movie that I always enjoyed growing up, I saw it way too young. I was probably like 10 or something, and I saw it and it gave me nightmares. But I also thought it was cool. Like, I don't know, like Hannibal Lecter was the kind of character that was terrifying, but also he had so much power and he was so smart that was the kind of character that I was like, ooh, he's such a badass. I don't know. I looked up to him in some ways, which is a fucked up thing to say, but you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think if you see it too young, you don't necessarily pick up on all of what's being said there, and he kind of seems like a monster. He kind of just seems like a horror monster that's all creepy and scary, and I think I saw it too young as well, and I felt the same way. But as time goes on and you start to realize what's under the surface there, you're like, wow, this is pretty close to what could actually happen in real life, and it's even more terrifying.
Yeah, I mean, I have 2 feelings on that. And the first is that when I was young, I actually it turns out on a rewatch now, I like him less than I did as a kid. He creeps me out a lot more, in a very, again, like a real way, like you're saying. But when I was a kid, the sheer amount of intimacy between him and Clarice, and it's not like a pleasant intimacy, but it's a very intimate relationship. That I really responded to. But on the other hand, the more that I've gotten older and learned more about, real life serial killers and things like that, he's too clever. Real serial killers aren't like that. And so it's always, that makes him, the elevated. He's what Ted Bundy wishes he'd been. That's who Ted Bundy was trying to convince people he was. But Ted Bundy was not that.
Yeah.
Well, Luke and I mentioned how it's almost supernatural, like his sense of smell, like all of these things that he talks about.
Well, and he doesn't get things wrong.
Yeah,
all of his assumptions about Clarice, aside from the weird fixation he has on suggesting that she's been sexually abused at some point, everything besides that he seems to be spot on about, and he's never corrected. We never see him be like brought up short and be like, okay, no, dude, you're wrong.
Right, which is a clever bit of storytelling there too, because it gives him so much power. And I think I made this point last week, and I was thinking of it again. He does seem like a dark Sherlock Holmes to me in that sense too.
Absolutely.
Like Sherlock Holmes is that way too, where like he just knows way more than he possibly could, and he's so brilliant, and everyone's in awe of his brilliance. And that's exactly what's going on with Hannibal. And we see that in those scenes too. Not only is his brilliance, but his danger. Like there's 100 people in that aircraft hangar when he shows up. You know what I mean? Like the security is so over the top and insane, and it just adds so much weight to this character because he's immobilized. You know, he's got the mask on and everything, yet everyone's terrified of him. So he's given so much power and such a great scene. But I'm getting ahead of ourselves a little bit here. I was trying to talk about my personal connection. My cousin, I guess once removed, it was really good friends with Jonathan Demme, and he has cameos in I think all of his movies. And he is in this movie. He is the preacher on the screen when the screen is like the punishment, and he's the guy who the volume's been turned down, but he's the preacher on the screen. And that's Jimmy Roach. He's an artist. He's a cool guy. I haven't really talked to him as much as I'd like to over the years, but I just wanted to shout him out because I've always known about that. You know, I was told this story, and so there was always this fun, like, personal family connection to this film, even if it's just a cousin, but I thought it was pretty cool.
Yeah, that is super cool.
Knowing that, when that moment popped up, I was like, there he is. He's gesturing on the TV and everything. Yeah. It was fun. And like, what a scene to cameo in, right? Like, the scene. Yeah. Like, the scene where Clarice and Hannibal meet for the first time. That scene is just...
Well, the second time.
Oh, you're right. Yeah.
The first time where they really meet, because that first time they're both posturing and there's no intimacy. That scene's where the first bits of their intimate connection start.
It's when because she goes back on her own. Mm-hmm. I think it's quite clear that she just decided to go there to talk to him. Yeah, and it was very much like a house call she's making, which is very different than being sent there deliberately by the commissioner, the FBI. What is his name? I always forget this guy's name.
Jack Crawford.
Jack Crawford. Thank you. I'm terrible with character names. That is like an ongoing thing on this podcast.
I did take copious notes, including about how Jack Crawford is a John Douglas XP. So if you ever want to talk, if we want to get into actual like true crime stuff, I have a bit about that ready to go.
Really?
Yeah.
Cool.
Actually, if you've watched the TV show Mindhunter, that's about John Douglas, who basically started the behavioral science unit at the FBI, who Jack Crawford is exactly patterned off of. You know, if you've watched Mindhunter, you know that his method is a little bit different than what Clarice goes in with, or that Jack Crawford has in Red Dragon, in that John Douglas is very, very, I just listened to an interview with him, he is very firm on the fact that you cannot trust a single thing out of a serial killer's mouth. They will lie. And most of the people who ever interviewed them believe their lies. Because they're like, you know, they're fascinated by the story and they lean into that mythologizing that happens. And instead, he would come in knowing their case record forwards and back, have no notes in front of him, and call them on their bullshit when they started just grandstanding. And it made them weirdly respect him and open up about some of the other details. But of course, he always took those details with a grain of salt because same thing. He knew that they could still very well be lying to him.
Yeah, that's why when you ever look up like the numbers of killed for any serial killer, you'll always see a stat that says like, and they claim they've killed 200 or something. Right. You'll always see that stat. Like they always have some astronomical number that they say they've killed. So,
there's that, and then there's also they usually will not claim kills that they did early where they feel like they screwed them up. Which, if we want to actually get back into Silence of the Lambs, since I know I'm taking us on a tangent.
Yeah, let's do it.
That actually, I mean, that comes up really early. That's, you know, one of our first really, not our first encounter with Buffalo Bill, but we do get to see one of his early kills. And that's what gets Clarice started down the road. And it's one that he probably would not have acknowledged.
Right. And I mean, ultimately leads to his downfall also. Like that's the big clue there. I think this is a good time to jump into filmmaker a little bit, and then we can sort of just jump into plot and talk about everything. So Jonathan Demme was an American director, producer, and screenwriter, best known for directing the psychological horror film Silence of the Lambs, which I think we should talk about. Is this horror? Is it ultimate like dark thriller? Like I think it's interesting to think about the fact that, you know, Hannibal Lecter is kind of like a Halloween costume now, and all this stuff, where it's kind of this movie, to me, especially after this viewing, seems much more thriller than it's kind of fascinating that he's become a horror character.
I mean, watching it now, and again, this is probably just because I spend way too much of my time consuming true crime related things. It just, to me, I watched it as a very effective crime thriller. And I say that it's not your standard crime thriller. In particular, and I know we'll get into this, but, you know, the scoring and the lighting in it, and just the way it's set up and paced, really makes it unique and haunting and intense. But it's weird because it's kind of two movies in one, isn't it? It's Buffalo Bill is a crime thriller and Hannibal is not. And his arc wraps up at what, the 3/4 point of the movie?
Yeah.
And I noticed that when I was watching, that sort of the way I was watching the movie changed at that point.
Yeah.
And the book's the same way. I mean, this is something we talked about last week, and I was really impressed with the structure of this story and how it played out, and how there was these different arcs going on, and there's two antagonists, and they shift back and forth, and I don't know, it's a complicated plot, and masterfully handled. And this movie clocks in at like a quick 2 hours, like it's right under 2 hours. And like you said, I think it's really well paced, and I'm impressed that it didn't bloat longer, especially when you have a full novel that you can touch on, and yet still feels so faithful.
Oh yeah.
As we talked about in the book episode, it feels like they took the book and turned it into a screenplay. Like there's not a ton that's been changed, and it feels, like you said, very faithful. But to jump back to Jonathan Demme, he's best known for Silence of the Lambs, for which he won Academy Award for Best Director. He is known for his casual humanist films such as Melvin and Howard, Swing Shift, Something Wild, Married to the Mob, Philadelphia, and Rachel Getting Married. He has also directed numerous concert films such as Stop Making Sense, Neil Young, Heart of Gold, and Justin Timberlake and the Tennessee Kids.
He also did some TV. I saw a bunch of episodes of different shows and stuff. So he's done a lot of different things.
Yeah, he's pretty prolific, and you know, it sounds like one of your relatives was good friends with him, so that's cool.
Yeah.
I also saw that just you know, coincidentally, you and I, our alma mater is University of Florida. He graduated from the University of Florida, so
right.
Nice little Gator shout out there.
Shout out.
But I mean, this film was originally going to be directed by Gene Hackman, who purchased the rights to the story. And I actually read that Jodie Foster, after reading the story, went to buy the rights and found out that Gene Hackman had already purchased them from before she could get to it. But anyway, so he was going to direct and potentially star as either Crawford or Hannibal Lecter. And eventually left the project, and in comes Jonathan Demme. And I think Jonathan Demme brought a lot to this film. I don't think it's an over-exaggeration. I think everybody universally almost loves this film. I think there are things that people point to as potentially problematic, but it's on the AFI list of top 100 films of all time. I think it's universally loved, and I think Jonathan Demme's voice, while subtle in this movie, can definitely be seen in sort of his direction, definitely throughout the whole movie.
One of the things I picked up on this time, I saw someone mention this before, and it kind of tipped me off to it, and then I was looking for it, was just the way people just stare. They stare at the camera. They stare at Clarice all the time. There's like an uncomfortable amount of eye contact in this movie. And it starts from the very beginning, because I was looking for it this time. It's every character she encounters at the FBI just stares at her. Yeah, and it's really effective, because we are, like, she is the audience stand-in, I think, in many ways. So, like, we feel like we're being stared at, right?
They're often also mobbing her. Aside from when she's with Hannibal, she's often, or with Buffalo Bill at the end, she's often surrounded by much taller men. In particular.
Yeah, way taller. Yeah.
And my first things, I had never really fully paid attention to the opening. And it's just this great set of contrast. You know, you have the woman alone jogging in the forest, which is the epitome of serial criminal bait that we see in true crime. You know, never go jogging by yourself.
Yeah.
But she's also she's at Quantico. She's, in sweats. She's going through the obstacle course. She's sweating. But then she gets in to go see Jack Crawford. And you notice she's wearing pearl earrings. You know, she's talking to Jack Crawford with, this sweat V down her front and back and her pearl earrings. And, her body language just exudes, do not fuck with me.
Right.
Yeah.
She's super capable too. That crazy rope ladder flip thing.
Oh,
and
yeah.
all of the stuff that goes on there, I think it is like very quickly showing. And she's also by herself, and she runs. I think we see other like groups of people that are together, and she's kind of a lone wolf out there, kind of, preparing.
Well, and she literally is pulling herself uphill, right? Like metaphorically, just this is uphill struggle for her.
And the music that's
organization, I think,
playing.
is
Oh my God, that's a great point. Let's talk about the music. So,
oh my God, it's beautiful.
Howard Shore, the composer.
Howard Shore,
incredible composer. And I was shocked to see on this. But God, if the score isn't just completely perfect, I felt that it invokes sort of like a detective feel, almost like a callback to noir of like the 40s and 30s, 40s, 50s, and yet at the same time it was much scarier, much more creepy than anything like that. It felt kind of, and the score that plays at the very beginning of the movie too, like we open with some creepy, she's jogging in the woods, and it's sort of this like somber yet overbearing and haunting. Like it already feels like it's gonna go down some dark paths.
It really reminded me of from the score for Vertigo, the Prelude.
Okay, yeah.
It's that same sort of tense but orchestral and lush, but just slightly off tone, and it has you just immediately unsettled but also really drawn in.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I love that. Howard Shore's killing it, man. He's been a favorite of the podcast.
What else is he? What else did he score?
He scored the Lord of the Rings trilogy.
Oh well.
Yeah, little trilogy with a pretty remarkable soundtrack.
Yeah, memorable at the least, right?
Incredible. And then, I feel like we've seen him in something else, but I might be wrong about that. Maybe it's just Lord of the Rings because we've spent so many episodes talking about.
I think he would go on to work with Jonathan Demme a lot. I think he worked on Philadelphia, which Tom Hanks was in, sort of story about the AIDS crisis, and it was an early '90s movie. I think it's cool to see like a composer director duo sort of form and then continue on together, because they have that short form like sort of like internal language with each other.
And I think that means he did the Hobbit films too, right, with Peter Jackson?
I don't actually know, but I would think so, probably.
I think he did. Yeah.
But I wanted to get back to the form of what you guys were talking about, the shots that are directly to camera, and like what we think that invokes, because that is, I think, one of the most notable things, because that's a big, bold choice. I think that can go off the rails really quickly if you don't have really great performances and people are going to camera. There's nothing else in the scene but their performance, and just what it means. We get sort of, if we're looking at someone, they're slightly, the camera's slightly low angled so that they're looking down at us, and like us being Clarice's point of view. So there's like sort of that dominant stare, intense judging camera work going on. And then if we're looking at her, she doesn't necessarily look to camera. She's looking mostly to camera, but there are times that she's not. And hers are a lot of the time from a high angle. So again, like we're from the perspective of whoever she's speaking to and looking down at her.
She looks through the camera a lot, especially when she's talking to, pretty much only when she's talking to Hannibal. She'll get this really great faraway look that doesn't look, ditzy or anything like that. It just looks, it looks traumatized because he is in effect traumatizing her again. But, it'll cut between them staring at each other. And neither of them is looking away. And then usually when one of them looks away, the other will too, which is an interesting thing.
Yeah, it's so uncomfortable too. We get that there's the shot that Clarice looks, we're in her perspective, first person view, and she's meeting with Hannibal, I believe, for the first time. She's looking at his drawings on the wall, and then slowly we pan back to Hannibal, and he's just staring at camera, and it's the creepiest thing to just like reveal him staring so intensely. Really, really just uncomfortable stuff. Really puts you on your back as the audience. You're just like, ooh, this doesn't feel like any movie that I've seen recently. Sort of feels unique.
If I recall, I don't remember where I heard this, but I heard at some point that Anthony Hopkins basically would pick periods of not blinking. So he does blink in the movie, but when he is doing one of those stare moments, he does not blink, and it's a very subconscious thing to the viewer, but it's super unsettling because the time is going on and on and on, and his eyes are not changing. His mouth may be moving, but his eyes aren't changing.
I didn't even know that, but now that you say it, I feel like I did subliminally know that. You know, I feel like with the way that he was staring, there's something about the way he angles his face too, and the lighting they have behind him, and like his face is in shadow, yet his shoulders are illuminated. Just it's so creepy. And I mean, the not blinking thing, of course he did that. How did I not even realize that? That's so funny.
It's Anthony Hopkins was doing stuff like that.
Yeah, I was staring at his eyes, like, and I noticed the lack of blinking, except for he does this thing sometimes where he would like half blink, and he would do it at particular moments. It was usually whenever Clarice would reveal something painful, like a painful memory, and he would do this kind of like half blink. He didn't fully shut his eyes. And I thought that was actually a really interesting choice, because I think you can read it as empathy at first, but like on this repeat viewing, I was thinking about the character in the novel being said to sort of kind of drink tears, essentially like the moth that he's compared to. And I was thinking that maybe he's actually relishing hearing the pain in her voice, and that's a moment of like of pleasure in his eyes. And it's interesting how like that recontextualized the whole moment for me. Whereas you can see it as like, oh, he's actually empathetic to her struggles. And I love that this little moment can be, like open to interpretation to the audience.
So did you guys want to jump into some plot? I'll read a paragraph and we can kind of react to all of the goings on.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right.
I'm eager.
FBI trainee Clarice Starling is pulled from her FBI training by Jack Crawford of the Behavioral Science Unit. He assigns her to interview Hannibal Lecter, whose insight might prove useful in the pursuit of a psychopath serial killer named Buffalo Bill, who kills young women and then removes the skin from their bodies. Starling travels to the Baltimore State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, where she is led to Lecter's solitary quarters. Although initially pleasant and courteous, Lecter grows impatient with Starling's attempts at dissecting him. As she is leaving, one of the prisoners flicks semen at her. Lecter, who considers this act unspeakably ugly, calls Starling back and tells her to seek out an old patient of his. This leads her to a storage shed, where she discovers a man's severed head with a moth lodged in its throat. Starling returns to Lecter, who tells her that the man is linked to Buffalo Bill. He offers to profile Bill on the condition that he may be transferred.
So I'm interested in the fact that leaves out the lovely interaction with Dr. Chilton. Because, I mean, I know, like, plot summaries, you cut a lot of fat. I've read enough synopses that I know that. But at the same time, what really struck me about that entire opening sequence is that aside from Crawford and Hannibal, and in different ways, every other person we see her interact with is trying to get her to respond in a specific way. Even Crawford is a little bit. But you have Chilton hitting on her and then getting mad when she's not receptive. You have Barney trying to be really sweet and nice to her, and he is really nice, but she's there to do her job. And then you have Hannibal, who, up until her clumsy way of trying to foist that questionnaire on him ticks him off, he is trying to measure her. He's not assuming anything. It's weird because he's still coming to conclusions and acting on them, but it feels different because he's actually seeking out information and trying to get her to reveal herself, as opposed to just going, "Oh, you're a woman, so I'm going to hit on you," like Chilton does. I really hate Chilton.
Oh, he's the worst.
The worst. I have very large angry all caps in my notes whenever he shows up.
Yeah.
And there's actually an interesting moment, too, with Chilton. It's that scene, it's that really brief little moment that's filmed from weird angles, all in red lighting, where he's explaining what Hannibal did to the nurse. And it's this really weird, it feels very interior and internal, and almost like Chilton shouldn't be there. But, it's this moment where we're seeing Clarice really start to, click into Hannibal's orbit and what that might mean. And I noticed that, and then of course we have the night vision at the end. So you have these two interesting bookend moments of Clarice and weird, intimate lighting.
I actually have another observation with the ending that I honestly hadn't thought of until now. I guess I'll talk about it here because why not? I think it's interesting to note, first of all of the training that we see, which I do want to sort of talk about something that I mentioned in the book episode. I remembered the film having less to do with the school, the FBI training and everything, and I was wrong with that. There was quite a bit of it, just probably about as much as there was in the book. But all of the training that we see, sort of her, forgetting to check her six at the one point when the, one of her instructors says he forgot, she's checking her six when nearing the end as she's going into this situation. And then very specifically, Buffalo Bill using the night vision is, it totally clicked in for me, is a man looking at Clarice again. And she's in a situation where she's just struggling to get through and, is at a disadvantage and all of these things. And it's like we're seeing from a man's point of view what Clarice is going through. And I just thought that was so interesting.
We're seeing her panic for the first time.
Yeah.
We never see her, like, we see her vulnerable. We see her crying about her dad, like dealing with the grief of her father being dredged up, all this stuff. But we never see her terrified until that moment. And then it's a really uncomfortably long sequence of, as soon as the lights go out, watching her shake and tremble and grapple, trying to like drag herself along the walls, and suddenly she's hunted, and like that is viscerally uncomfortable to watch, and you're really starting to wonder, like, this is dragging on quite a while. And what usually happens? It's we can talk about horror and the final girl premise because it basically drops into that in a way, and in that case, from that perspective, okay, Clarice is going to survive, but from the crime thriller side of things, this looks like what happens right before one of the victims gets killed.
Yeah, I love that. I two things to respond to what you guys just said. The red scene, I love that scene for two reasons. One was it backed up my descending into hell theory from the book, when she's going to meet Hannibal, and I thought this was very like, we are crossing into hell now. We're going through the red.
I was thinking about the fact that you mentioned that a lot while we were watching this, and I kept thinking of more descending into hell moments that I feel like draw parallels to that.
And then I also think it's a really narratively important moment because that's the only time we hear about Hannibal committing a crime against a woman and this nurse that he attacked. True. And I think it's important that we get that. Otherwise, you might think that she would be spared Hannibal Lecter because she is a woman. But that immediately tells you, no, she is in danger too.
Well, and that actually, again, I have two things to respond to that because we have so many branching thoughts here. But I found it really interesting on a rewatch. While there's sexual violence in the sense that Buffalo Bill is targeting women to torture and murder and skin, he doesn't rape them. And we actually don't see that particular kind of violence at all in the movie, which I think is a really interesting... Well,
Miggs would be the
aside
only
from Miggs. But like, it's not in Buffalo Bill's background, it's not in Hannibal's background, and it's something that is almost, taken for granted in a lot of serial killer cases and true crime stuff and horror even. I'm interested to know what you guys think about why, because I think that's also true of the book, although it's been much longer since I read the book. And why, like, do you think it was a conscious decision? Because I do, because I think that it allows, it's more, in a weird way, it's more welcoming to women readers and viewers and stuff. If you take that out, it's like when you're playing horror tabletop games. There's a concept called the X card, where if something comes up that people don't want to explore during the game, you tap it, no questions asked, you move on. And a lot of times, that or pre-game negotiations are used to just sort of remove that real world, very familiar horror, so that it's actually still enjoyable to everybody at the table. I wonder if it's that or if it's something else.
I mean, I absolutely think that that's part of it. I think whether it's Thomas Harris or Jonathan Demme or both, this feels like a story that's attempting to be pretty feminist. And I think you would lose a lot of that audience, like you said, if the killer was, perpetrating sexual violence. And it would undercut that message. It's really trying to show Clarice struggling in a man's world, quote unquote, at the FBI, and the difficulty. And I love, part of the reason why I love some of the training sequences is not only showing how difficult it is to be an FBI agent and the kind of training they have to go through, but also the added layer of difficulty that she's dealing with at all times. It keeps getting reinforced with the way the men treat her. So yeah, I think you're right. I think it had to be intentional. I think if I was to level criticism at this movie for anything, it would be that it feels pretty transphobic, even though it tries to distance itself from that. it's impossible to have a character like Buffalo Bill be the way that they are without coming off as transphobic.
Yeah.
So other than that, and that's my one main gripe. I really feel like this is a pretty progressive, story in a genre that is not always like that.
Yeah. Oh, we get that with Catherine Martin, too. The first time we see her, she's not just rushing to help this hapless guy in her parking lot. She stands there for a moment going, what the hell is this dude doing in my parking lot? Do I want to deal with this right now? I just got back from grocery shopping. My cat's waiting for me. Which, was a really recognizable and human moment of, you can see her weighing it. And every step of the way, she's like, okay, this is getting weird. My alarm bells are ringing. Spidey sense is going off. But at the same time, here's this guy and he needs help. Which is exactly, that's the very obvious Bundy pool of
exactly
of details.
Yeah.
But
as someone who also consumes a bit of true crime media out there, I definitely recognize that this was like an exact ploy that Bundy would pull.
Yeah,
and they definitely lifted that. So the other thing I wanted to respond to was the sort of setup and payoffs in this movie that I picked up on. You guys talked about the guards, but I was thinking about the wing motif and how we get it with the moss, but then I was also noticing it with the death of the guard. And the way that he gets strung up later by Hannibal having the wings and be sort of angelic. And then, which maybe is, you could say, as Hannibal actually as an homage to James Gumb in some way. And then you also see it with even the scene, the infamous tuck scene. I was thinking about the way he sort of is holding out his clothing almost like wings. And when he's kind of doing that dance. And how even that is sort of moth-like, and how is this kind of recurring visual motif that I thought was really cool.
There's right at the end, there's that long, or not at the end, right after James Gumb has been killed, there's that long shot of that spinning paper thing with the two butterflies and the one butterfly, and the two butterflies and the one butterfly. And like my brain has always known, like, oh, that's symbolic of something. And I think I finally figured it out that it's, we've had both Clarice is clearly going through a transformation, and James Gumb is trying to go through a transformation. And only one of them comes out having actually been transformed, and the other one's dead.
Oh, yeah.
Their transformations are only tentatively linked to each other, but they do collide at that last moment. And Clarice definitely comes out changed for it.
Yeah, I think the whole movie really just is filled with motifs of transformation, whether it's like, Hannibal using whatever he gets from Clarice, and maybe, eventually, because you have to think like Clarice, whether she, she wasn't directly the reason why he escaped, but she had like sort of a glancing sort of effect on it, because had he never opened up in any way, he never would have been moved, and that sort of, that led him to Memphis, or I believe that's where it was, Tennessee. It's just interesting to think of like every character in the story transforming in some way, I guess, or at least Buffalo Bill and Clarice and Hannibal.
There's a line, and I didn't write down the full line because I assumed I would remember it, and of course I don't. But there's a moment where Lecter is explaining something, and he says, I can't remember if he says, student or whatever first, but then he glosses it as pupil. Like he restates it using the word pupil, and it sounds kind of clunky and weird because, yes, we know what a student is or whatever. It wasn't that hard of a word that he was defining. But then if you go pupil to pupa to the transformative imagery, pretty sure it was intentional.
Wordplay.
Yeah. Just, especially because he is, in a large way, shepherding Clarice through a rebirth and recontextualization of everything that she's gone through and everything she's learned up until this point to create this new creature.
Right.
And then if you read Hannibal, there's definitely a thing of creating Clarice and sculpting her and doing weird stuff.
Well, and you reminded me of something that I meant to bring up last episode, but I forgot. And that is, I feel like Hannibal and Crawford both represent these sort of surrogate father figures for her in some ways. Even though you talked about it being sort of a romantic relationship at times, or feeling just very intimate. But there's also very much a mentor-mentee sort of relationship going on both sides. And, I think it's pointed that it's her father who died when she was young. Yep. And so there's sort of this absence of a father figure. So I think there's just so much going on in this movie. Like, I love that they packed so much into this 2-hour runtime. It's pretty incredible.
If you or the listeners want to know just how complex and convoluted the familial projections get, definitely read Hannibal, because he elaborates on the theme in some very unique ways.
Okay. I don't remember that movie hardly at all, by the way. I have seen it, but it was a long time ago, and only once.
The book and the movie have slightly different endings. The book's ending is... It was formative, and I'm not sure it was formative in a good way for me.
Interesting.
I don't want to spoil it because, if you're going to go in, you should go in not prepared for that.
And we've already talked about how we need to cover Red Dragon, apparently, because James hasn't even seen it.
Yeah, I have no clue.
I think that's my second favorite Hannibal movie, so...
Would you watch Red Dragon, or would you watch Manhunter? Because they're both based off of...
Yeah, I think we would watch both. I think we would cover Red Dragon for the podcast, because I think it's probably the more well-known film. Yeah. But we would definitely cover Manhunter for probably a bonus episode or something. But yeah, I've heard that, and I'm curious about it. I think I called it Mindhunter last week. It's like a slip of the tongue. Just because I've been watching all right, I like Mindhunter, but it is Manhunter, and so thank you for giving me an opportunity to correct that, because I said that wrong last week.
But yeah, that it's weird too. It's interesting because it's a different actor playing Hannibal, and you really realize how used to imagining him as Anthony Hopkins you are at that point.
Yeah. Well, and that's the same problem I have. Like the Hannibal show, it takes a while to get used to Mads Mikkelsen as Hannibal.
I like Mads.
Although I think he does a good job in his own right. It just takes a little bit. It's a little weird.
It was hard for the Hannibal movie. I'm sorry, I'm dragging you guys off topic again, but the Hannibal movie going to Julianne Moore instead of Jodie Foster. That was an adjustment for sure.
Oh, and I have saying Jodie Foster's name reminded me. I really wanted to shout out how much I think she does incredible work in this movie. I think she gets often kind of forgotten when everyone's talking about Anthony Hopkins, who is incredible. But I really thought she did great work. I think she gets she gets some shit for her Southern accent at times. I don't have the best ear for that, even though I grew up around some Southern accents. It seemed okay to me. But there's so much more going on with her performance than just the accent. Like she does really good work in this movie.
I mean, first of all, she won an Oscar for Best Actress, which I think deservingly so. She's incredible in this movie. Good. She comes up to Anthony Hopkins, Hannibal Lecter, who is built to be a scene stealer, and contends with him, and I think turns in just as good of a performance. I guess to talk about that real quick, this movie actually did basically sweep, which has only been done 3 times. It won Best Actor, Actress, Director, Picture, and Best Screenplay.
Wow.
So, I mean, that's a huge accomplishment. It was the 1991 Oscars, I believe. And the only 2 other movies to ever do it were It Happened One Night in 1934 and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in 1975.
Oh, cool. Hey, a potential project.
Yeah, I would like to do that at some point. Yeah, so, I mean... To talk about the performances, it's like clearly this movie was really well received, and Jodie Foster, shout out to her because she killed it. Did you guys want to move into some more plot real quick so we can?
Yeah, let's get some more plot.
So Buffalo Bill abducts a senator's daughter, Catherine Martin. Crawford authorizes Starling to offer Lecter a fake deal promising a prison transfer if he provides information that helps them find Buffalo Bill and rescue Catherine. Instead, Lecter demands a quid pro quo from Starling, offering clues about Bill in exchange for personal information. Starling tells Lecter about the murder of her father when she was a child. Chilton secretly records the conversation and reveals Starling's deceit before offering Lecter a deal of Chilton's own making. Lecter agrees and is flown to Memphis, where he verbally torments Senator Martin and gives her misleading information on Buffalo Bill, including the name Lewis Friend. Starling notices that Lewis Friend is an anagram for iron sulfide, fool's gold. She visits Lecter, who is now being held in a cage-like cell in a Tennessee courthouse, and asks for the truth. Lecter tells her that all the information she needs is contained in the case file. Rather than give her the real name, he insists that they continue their quid pro quo, and she recounts a traumatic childhood incident where she was awakened by the sound of lambs being slaughtered. Starling admits that she still sometimes wakes thinking she can hear the lambs screaming, and Lecter speculates that she is motivated to save Catherine in the hope that this will end the nightmares. Lecter gives her back the case file on Buffalo Bill after their conversation is interrupted by Chilton, who escorts her away. Lecter kills his guards, escapes from his cell, and disappears.
At this point, right when this conversation was, right when Clarice and Hannibal's interaction here was starting, I was still going, wow, I still don't find this interaction as compelling as I did when I was younger. I wonder, like, is the magic gone for me? Do I just know too much and not trust anybody? And then when she's being dragged away from him, and suddenly it's them against the world. And then, of course, there's the finger touch to cement it. There's the very nice little zoom in of the gentle sexual finger stroke. Which, you know, to preteen teenage Caitlin was just catnip because, ooh. But it was really interesting because, yeah, up until that point, as intimate as they are, they're adversarial. And then just for one moment, they're not. And I think that that's crucial to why this movie stuck with people and why, you know, Clarice and Hannibal became such iconic figures is because, you know, as much as Hannibal is manipulative and trying to set Clarice off and trying to take her measure and all of this, there's this very real sense of not empathy, like you said, like you can read it as empathy, but maybe not. But there's this definite, it matters. It matters to both of them. It's intimate and it matters to both of them, whether that's a good thing or not, and whether it's a positive, you know, interaction for them or not, which I don't think it is for Clarice. I have a lot of thoughts about, you know, both because of writing The Luminous Dead and being on some panels about why we find villains so attractive, that it's often not only a mirroring of the protagonist, but also this protracted intimacy where the villain understands something fundamental about the main character that no one else sees and no one else gets. And in Clarice's case, it's he actually sees her real vulnerability, not the vulnerability that everyone else just assumes because she's a woman, because she's weak, because whatever. He drills down to the point where they get into some very heavy, very, you know, grief-filled stuff. And I'm still grappling with why he keeps going to, so did your dad molest you? Did the rancher molest you? Who molested you? But I almost think that it's a challenge to her of, this is the easy answer, and I know it's not the easy answer. What is it?
I also wonder if it's, you know, I think he respects how quickly she gets to the point sometimes. And so in those moments when he does that, it's almost like trying to see if she'll falter at like the most grotesque thing he could say. And
test.
He's testing. And I think in terms of this attraction, I think because we're so close to Clarice's point of view, we're basically in her point of view. When we can tell that Hannibal cares for her in some way, which I don't know, maybe Hannibal has me tricked as well, but I think that he cares for Clarice in some way. And I think because of that, we start to, you know, we hear about all the awful things he's done, and we start to push that to the side. And this is, you know, pre him breaking out, obviously. So as you know, he gives over the notes or the file for the last time, and they touch fingers and everything. That's like the peak moment of us being able to be like, maybe this guy isn't so bad after all. And then does the most horrific thing that he could possibly do.
He becomes suddenly much more elegant and predatory than we've seen him be before. Just the way that Anthony Hopkins is standing, the way that his shirt is incredibly tight, but also just the very visceral way that he attacks people. It's not I say that he's very elegant and predatory, but his attacks are vicious. But he's also going with the music, with the time of the music, when he gets the nightstick.
That was a choice, by the way. The white was a choice by Anthony Hopkins. Apparently, he has a fear of dentists and doctors and things like that, and he felt that other people might feel that as well. So he went with sort of the all white.
It does look like a dentist.
It does, right? And not only does the blood look even crazier on a white shirt, but I think it was a cool choice for sure.
So I've been thinking about what you were talking about with why does he go to that? And I think he could be testing her a little bit, but I think he also is sort of like, he's getting that one out of the way. Because I think that's probably like the most common thing he probably heard in his practice as a psychologist. So he's like getting that one out of the way. He's like, if it's that, I'm just going to say it so that you're not going to like dance around it. I'm aware that this goes on. I'm going to put it out there. And then, he's like hoping it's not that, but he just wants to like get it out there. And then also like anything she comes in with now isn't going to seem quite as bad because he's already said that thing.
Yeah.
That is like one of the worst things you could do. So I don't know. I guess that's why I think he's probably doing it.
Because to me, it just didn't feel far enough away from Miggs and the stupid cum scene. Like,
right. Well, and she says like that's something Miggs would say at one point.
Yeah,
too,
he does,
right?
and he stops. He turns immediately. He drops the line of questioning and turns, which I thought was a really great choice. But I also was like sitting there going, okay, why do you keep bringing it up if this kind of rudeness bothers you? But I think you're right that it's in his perspective, it would make her more interesting if it wasn't sexual abuse.
Yeah, he wants to get that away. Right, straight off, let's get that out of the way so that we can find out what's more interesting than that.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to mention a choice that was made by the director here. I think it would have been very easy when Starling was giving the sort of her monologue about why she hears the screaming of the lambs and all of this. I think that it could have been very easy to cut away to a some sort of flashback or something like that and have her narrate over top of it. And I actually found something in my research. While watching, I was like, wow, like this, I totally could have seen somebody cutting away, but how powerful is this just to see the raw emotion and really let these performances speak for themselves. But in my research, I found something that backed it up a little bit. The filmmakers were prepared to go to Montana to shoot a flashback sequence depicting Clarice's runaway attempt. After filming the dialogue between Jodie Foster and Sir Anthony Hopkins, Jonathan Demme realized it would be pointless to cut away from their performances and announced, "I guess we aren't going to Montana."
Nice.
You go.
Did you take a look at everything that's on like the table in his little pen? Because of course you have the painting that or the charcoal drawing that it lingers on of Clarice as Madonna with lamb, but he also has a Bon Appetit magazine.
I did.
Who gave him that? Who gave him that? Like in world, who was like,
whoever allowed him to demand a second dinner, apparently,
of rare lamb, yeah.
And what's crazy to me is like I guess they're not really keeping track of all the things that he has because she brings him that roll of all of the drawings and everything, and then they move them around and stuff and don't think anything of it. It's like how easily could someone have slipped a weapon in there or something? And anyway, I just think it's interesting.
Or a pen.
Oh, he got the pen from Chilton though. Chilton's a sex pen that he likes to fiddle around with his mouth with.
Which, like, how did he get that? Who knows? But magic.
Yep. The cell, I wanted to talk about how it looks visually. And like, I know it's not necessarily practical, but it is in the book. But to have like a cell that they erect in the middle of like a gymnasium or whatever that is.
Yeah.
And the light that they're able to shoot through it and the way that...
It's like a courthouse or something. It's very grand.
Yeah.
Whatever it is.
Yeah, it's definitely monumental architecture.
And then the way that it kind of juxtaposes what we get early on where they're only separated by glass. So it seems like there's nothing separating them in some of their first meetings. And speaking of Starling and Hannibal. And then here it's literally like cages in all of the shots. There's actual bars separating them. And as we like dolly across, you can see like it just creates a different and interesting effect. But, this is the scene where we get the breakout and everything happens, the face cutting, wearing the face. What do we think of the change of adding the sort of angelic symbolism? What does that mean there? Do you think that it's him being sort of performative or is there something the filmmaker was trying to say? What do you guys think of that?
It fits with Hannibal giving them what they want. They want a monster, here's a monster. If they want something larger than life, here, he's giving you something larger than life. And so it plays to their assumptions about him, but it's also very distracting. It pulls the focus off of...
Good point.
I don't think if you actually skinned a guy's face, would it really be convincing lying on top of your face with your nose underneath it? So, I mean, in the movie, of course, it's shot so it looks nice and convincing. But I feel like you definitely do need the shock and awe to really sell that they may have actually missed that this is Lecter on the ground.
I like that. You very, very reasonable explanations. I also like the idea of it being sort of an homage to James Gumb. Like he is fully aware that this crime has been going on, and the transformation is on his mind, the moth is on his mind, and he's talked about the chrysalis and talked about the butterfly, and now when he has his chance, this is what he represents. I always thought of it more of as an angel, but now I think of it more as a butterfly to line up with that. Great scene. I mean, and I want to back up a little bit before we move past it. I mentioned it early on, but I feel like it's one of the biggest moments in this movie, and that's when he is brought to the hangar and he's got the mask on and he's in the straitjacket and there's a million people standing around. He's brought before the senator. And I was thinking about how it's rare, but every now and then we get to cover a project where we see something, and I think, like, if you were going to do a highlight of some of the best movie moments of all time, and you were just going to do it in like 5 minutes, like some of these scenes that might be in there, and I feel like this is one of them. You know what I mean? Like, this is an iconic moment. Everyone recognizes. You can just see it for a second and get it. It's so formative in Anthony Hopkins' career, I think. Just incredible and a powerful scene. And, iconic. And I feel like we take it for granted. That's the other thing I was thinking. Oh yeah, it's this scene. And I'm like, no, this scene's really incredible. I don't know. Just shout out to the costume design that came up with that.
Yeah, my only notes on that are Lecter, shut up about boobs. Toughened your nipples, WTF.
Yeah.
But I might note that he really likes to push people away and then yank them back, and then push them away again and then yank them back again.
Yeah.
But mostly I was upset about the nipple thing.
Well, and it's like one of the worst things he could say to her as a mother, I think, is what he's trying to say. Like, he's just twisting the knife. And we got some insight of that in the book where it talks about him. He's compared to this moth who drinks tears. And so I think that this is a moment of him, like, savoring, because I think he even has this thought where he says, like, ooh, that's enough, after she reacts to it. So, like, he's getting something out of it. Like, he loves it. And I think that made it on the screen, I think, in this scene for me. It made more sense after reading it.
I find that scene to be extremely iconic as well, and I think that costuming is why it's that's why it's a Halloween costume. That is the costume, right? Like, if you have like a dummy, you put that costume on it, people are like, holy shit, Hannibal Lecter's here. But for some reason, I think there's so many other scenes in this movie that I prefer, like him behind glass and the way that he's looking and stuff. Even the scene that we were just talking about in the cage. It's just interesting that that's the scene that became the defining scene, because as power, I think it is a good scene because he's completely chained down.
Power cosplay, like you said.
Yeah, and it's like he's got the crazy eyes and he's able to do a lot with his eyebrows, but to me, like, so many other scenes really stood out. And maybe it's just like I'm taking it for granted.
Pulling the face off.
Yeah,
that moment happened so fast, but man, he ripping another man's face off, and he's so covered in blood, like. Man, how about that mustache before we move past it? There's a fucking mustache in this movie that I feel like I have to point out.
It comes way out. Yeah, I don't even know what you call that one. It comes all the way to, like, the cheek.
I did not notice the mustache. Whose mustache?
You didn't notice the mustache?
But it didn't stick.
It goes straight across his cheeks. It's amazing.
One of the guards, the main guard actually, his mustache goes basically all the way to, like, the back of his chin.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
Yeah, no,
that's impressive.
In like a little line.
Speaking of hair, though, Hannibal Lecter's very extensive comb back that you only really get to see when he's in the cage because you get those overhead shots. But it's long. He's got a lot of long hair that he's combed back over his bald spot.
Yeah,
that I was not prepared for. I was like, that's
some hair loss for sure.
That's a look.
Yeah.
I think it's just having seen Mads Mikkelsen be him. It's now like, I don't think Hannibal would be that weird about his comb over.
Very, very different Hannibal, for sure. But good one.
All right, let me get into some more plot here. Starling analyzes Lecter's annotations to the case files and realizes that Buffalo Bill knew his first victim. Starling travels to the victim's hometown and discovers that Buffalo Bill was a tailor, from a dress she sees that was having alterations done. She calls Crawford to inform him that Buffalo Bill is trying to create a woman's suit out of real skin, but Crawford is already en route to make an arrest, having cross-referenced Lecter's notes with hospital archives. Starling interviews friends of the victim in Ohio, while Crawford leads an FBI team to the suspect's address in Illinois. The house in Illinois is empty, and Starling is led to the house of Jack Gordon, whom she realizes is actually Buffalo Bill after finding a moth. She pursues him into the multi-room basement, where she discovers that Catherine is still alive. After turning off the basement lights, Gum stalks Starling in the dark with night vision goggles, but gives his position away when he cocks his revolver. Starling reacts just in time and fires off all of her rounds, killing Gum. Later at the FBI Academy graduation party, Starling receives a phone call from Lecter, who is at an airport in Bimini. He assures her that he does not plan to pursue her and asks her to return the favor, which she says she cannot do. Lecter then hangs up the phone, saying that he is having an old friend for dinner and starts following a newly arrived Chilton before disappearing into the crowd.
So we should probably talk about a little bit about Buffalo Bill, since he is the ostensible actual plot of the movie, and I feel like we haven't talked about him much. But I think that's partially because he really doesn't come into focus until after Hannibal is out, which is probably why the sort of dual narrative works so well, is that we're not asked to juggle too much of both at one time. But there are just a lot of little details about him that I find fascinating, like all the photos of him with strippers that we see through Clarice's thing, which apparently was a move to prove that he wasn't just a weird, evil gay man, which I don't really think helped. He also has a swastika quilt, which I only noticed for the first time.
Yeah. I know there's several white supremacy swastika things. There's another swastika thing later.
Yeah.
And I felt like that was some of the most accurate stuff for this sort of killer.
Yeah.
Often drawn to white supremacy, as we know.
But do you want to talk about
true crime at all?
Catherine Martin and just how intense and ballsy she is for being, the victim in the well, nice inverted tower symbolism stuff. But her trick with the bucket to try and get the dog, to get Precious, who I keep wanting to call Bleep because there's this serial killer named Dennis Nielsen who had a dog, and his dog was named Bleep. It was another small little dog.
Oh, wow.
But Precious, the whole "don't you hurt my dog, don't you make me hurt your dog" exchange is it's extremely powerful and kind of unexpected.
How would that have gone if Clarice hadn't interacted with it and interrupted it? I don't think it would have necessarily gone well for her, but
probably not.
I don't know. Like you said, she's quite capable. She definitely was gonna go out swinging. You know what I mean? Like she wasn't just gonna take it. And props to her for that. It was cool. It was a smart move. I like to see her sort of trying to rescue herself, which I think is an important characteristic for someone like her.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just comparing it with serial killer movie that I happened to watch recently, and that also Amazon Prime suggested I watch when I paused Silence of the Lambs at one point last night, which is the Jennifer Lopez movie, The Cell, which that's a fascinating one.
I don't think I've seen that since I was like 12 or something. I barely remember. I think I saw it in the theater though whenever it came out.
It's bizarre and phantasmagoric and in some ways amazing and in some ways kind of cheesy. But that they're also trying to track down a woman who's been kidnapped by a serial killer who they found previous bodies from, and so they know they have a ticking clock that they have 3 or 4 days to find her. And to compare, whenever you see her in this room that just, periodically keeps filling with water because it's eventually going to drown her. It's this very, Rube Goldberg-esque thing. She does some sort of token trying to escape stuff, but nothing that feels as real as how Catherine is depicted, of being, she's not trying to be nice. She's trying to fight. Which, I really appreciated it for, since we were kind of shoved into this crime thriller narrative for the last quarter or so of it, that it wasn't just around damsel in distress. We have not only Clarice, but we have Catherine throwing roadblocks in the way.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that when she sees the nails, I think that's a turning point for her. And it's a great horrific scene when she sees the blood and the nails, but I think she realizes, unless I do something, I'm not getting out of this alive. Yeah. And I think that's when she after, she's terrified, but then afterwards she starts forming this plan.
So we talked about it a little bit, but and we also mentioned it in the book episode, but I feel like we should again bring up the depiction of seemingly, at least in Hannibal's words, Buffalo Bill is not someone who's trans, and there are images that are meant to, like you said, the photos with strippers that are sort of meant to say he's also not homosexual, but we're not sure. Where I guess my question is, where do you guys land with how this holds up today? Does this seem like they did their best? Does it seem like something that they didn't do enough?
The thing that puts me in the I'm not happy with it camp is, that gratuitous lingering shot of him playing with his nipple ring. That to me is just look at this shorthand for depraved queer person. And even though we've said that he's not really trans, even though we've said this is about hatred of women and hatred of himself, and there are certain choices that the filmmakers made that A, don't hold up, and B, I don't think were good at the time either. I know there was
Yeah.
some backlash at the time it came out as well. And there's interesting conversations. This actually comes up with a couple real life serial killers where there's some discussion of, well, do we think Ed Gein might have been trans, or do we think it was this weird religious hatred of women thing that his mother inculcated in him? There's a serial killer named Haddon Clark who I was convinced was part of the background, how they came up with Buffalo Bill, until I realized he was arrested in 92, so that's not right. But he, all the coverage of him was, and he was wearing women's panties. And it's just all this stuff that's it's a mainstay of the true crime genre, but it just doesn't work for me, and it never has. Doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And especially when it goes into the sort of the nipple ring or the women's panties in the voiceover voice, it's just there to shock.
Yeah, it's like I said, it's kind of unfortunate because I feel like this movie means well in so many ways, and then it gets something pretty bad. And yeah, I read about there being a backlash to this, being some protests, things like that. And a lot of it is in the source material, so I don't know how much of it we want to lay on Demme's feet or not. It's interesting that he would go on to make Philadelphia 2 years later. Now, that's not a movie I've seen, but I am aware of what it's about. I don't know if you two have seen it, but I feel like it's a really important movie about the AIDS epidemic. So I don't know. It's just interesting that the same filmmaker made both of these, and I don't know, was he atoning for anything there? That's tough to say.
So something that I was thinking about during this viewing too is that and I'm not super well informed enough to really know where I land on this stuff, but Buffalo Bill coveted women's bodies and wanted that, right? And yet there's this moment of like celebration of his own body where he's like dancing the tuck scene. Do you think that was just inconsistency with the character, or was there something being done there? Because I just didn't really know what to make of it, because it seemed like a confident moment, but for someone who didn't necessarily identify with their body in that way, I'm not sure.
Yeah, given that the only piece of his woman's suit that he's wearing is the scalp, which is interesting because A, he has nice long hair of his own, and B, they make wigs.
Yeah.
It was an interesting pairing to have that be the only obviously grotesque thing, and then the rest of it is he's wearing this really nice robe and dancing around to some great music and seeming to have a great time.
That song is awesome, by the way.
It's a good song.
I found that song on Spotify later, and I was like, this song's cool. Anyway, I have to actually point out a moment. I was watching it earlier today. I watched this movie today, and my wife walked by. She'd walked by several times throughout the movie, and she'd always kind of glance over and see what was going on, and then like continue on to the kitchen or wherever she was going. I had my headphones in, she couldn't hear it, and she walked by and glanced over right during the tuck scene, and she had this moment, and I was like, it's just perfect timing. What a scene to walk over and glance at. I love it. I think she's only seen the movie like once ever, and had probably forgotten that scene or was hoping to forget it. It's pretty funny. Here at the end, I want to touch on another thing that I feel like comes back, and that is, you talked about it a little bit with the checking her six, but also shooting Jane Gum. I felt like had a mirror towards the start of the film where she gets attacked by Miggs, breaks down a little bit. We see her crying by her car. And then the next scene, she's blasting in the firing range. And here we see her struggling, like you said, panicking in fear under his gaze. And then he clicks, and then she turns and she fires off a bunch of rounds into this guy, killing him. And I felt like that was a moment that was set up. Like I was starting to see all these setups and payoffs in this film. Again, just structurally, really pretty impressive, and just a tight story. I don't know. I was really impressed with it.
So in terms of Clarice, Jodie Foster apparently worked really closely with the FBI.
Okay.
And so specifically one agent named Mary Ann Krause. And apparently, they spent a lot of time together. And Krause gave Foster the idea of Starling standing by the car and crying. And she said, Krause told Foster that at times the work just becomes so overwhelming that it was a good way to get an emotional release. But, you mentioned that scene where she's crying by her car, and I thought that there's a couple of moments where we see that Clarice clearly is like in a man's world, having to be extremely tough. And then, you know, still being a human character and being somebody that we empathize with, we get this scene of her crying, which clearly I think almost anyone would after what she went through there. Not even just Hannibal, but also like the semen situation that went down.
Yeah.
And then we also see the most vulnerable parts of Clarice when she's with Hannibal and she's completely spilling everything in a movie where otherwise she's completely stonewalling everyone and she's extremely tough and doesn't show any of that vulnerability. So yeah, I just thought that the idea to cry by the car, I feel like people might look at it and say like, oh, she's crying because she was, you know, all this stuff and she can't handle it and she's a woman, but that's not how I read it at all. It was much more that like we're getting all sides of a character. We're getting what realistically would happen in a situation like this. And I thought it was interesting that it also came from someone who's dealt with this kind of thing in real life.
Yeah, and there's also and now the way I read that scene on this watch was not so much the thing with Meg's causing it, but the fact that right before that, Hannibal had been making assumptions about who her father was.
Mm-hmm.
Because then she goes out and she's crying and she's thinking about who her father actually was. And it might just be that I'm obsessed with writing about grief and about people not really being able to process grief of losing a parent young until they're older for various reasons. But, you know, yeah, that thing with Meg's may have been the tipping point that, you know,
Right.
It was just like, okay, screw this. But I think it's important that she thinks about her dad then, and she's not thinking about her dad then just because she's feeling overwhelmed and alone and everything else. She's thinking about her dad because Hannibal made her think about her dad. And she doesn't counter anything he says during that session. It's not until later that she explains that he was a cop. She keeps that to herself. She goes out, she processes it.
I like that. So let's circle back around to the fatherhood thing, because my proposal that Crawford sort of represents a little bit of a father figure for her, as well as Hannibal. I think that comes from full circle in the final scene here, where he is sort of standing in the back of the room and he gives a little clap, and then he checks his watch and has to go, and she sort of gets this approval from this father figure. We talked about in the book how we weren't very fond of the different note that the book ends on, and that's where she ends up sleeping with and going and starting a relationship with one of the bug guys. And that's kind of how she's happy that she's with this guy at the end. And we just felt like that didn't seem to work as well for the character. So I like this better, but it's still her like earning the approval of a man, which still feels a little off for me for the character who is so independent and finding her own way. So how do you feel about that, Caitlin?
So Clarice, like, in general, both in the movie, in the book, in Hannibal, the movie and the book, she's always this contradiction that I think comes from Thomas Harris wanting it both ways. Because Clarice as a character is designed to be manipulated by Hannibal. And when you have that role, everything else you pile on top of it can get wiped away. And so I think the way that he tried to work with that and keep the balance is that their interactions are very complex and they're very back and forth. And some of that breaks down in Hannibal. Again, that's not what this podcast is about. But but yeah, I mean, the thing is that the movie puts such a lens on how men treat Clarice that it's in the forefront of your mind, which is a great thing, except then, yeah, her only female contact, the only women in the movie, there's Catherine, who just yells at Clarice very understandably when she doesn't understand what Clarice is trying to do to free her. The senator...
I love that she calls her a bitch.
Yeah.
You fucking bitch. It's such a great moment because it's so unexpected that she
but
would say
very
that.
human. But then the senator, and then
Yeah, very.
Clarice's roommate, who is apparently brilliant and who Clarice trusts enough to literally give direct quotes of what Hannibal said, because her roommate quotes it back to her later. When we never see them have that original conversation.
She's a bigger character in the book.
Yeah, I thought I remembered that, but wasn't sure. But it's interesting. Her final thing with Crawford, the thing that stood out to me was not so much the standing in the back of the room and checking his watch. He comes up afterwards and he shakes her hand, and it's the most professional interaction she has had with a man in that entire movie. It's the only time someone's treated her professionally.
You get that zoom in of the handshake, and it is again sort of a mirror image to what happens with Hannibal and the finger stroke.
Yeah, but but in terms of does it work? I think it's a mess. I think parts of it work. I think parts of it have worked better for me at different points in my life, which is actually fairly indicative of it being a nice, complex character instead of character relationships, that it does have all these different facets. But I do think that it's undermined, especially by the fact that there aren't many women in Clarice's world. And while I understand what both Thomas Harris and the director were trying to do, it also undermines, it makes the I'm not like other girls thing the general problem that we run into with fiction too.
Yeah, for sure.
That Clarice isn't like other women and she's alone in a man's world and all this stuff, but it's,
she likes shooting guns and doing fun man stuff.
Right. And, there's a story to be told there of, that can be true. And the question is, did she choose to not have female relationships aside from her roommate? Are we just not being shown them? There's a whole lot there that you could explore, but this, again, it's a tight little movie. There's not a lot of room for it. I'm not sure where you'd put it.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's kind of a cop-out, but, I mean, this movie came out 30 years ago. I feel like it worked a little better 30 years ago, but, today, I think today it doesn't quite hold up in that way. But at the time, it was probably actually, pretty forward-thinking, and it was probably shocking to some people to see all of these storylines on display in this sort of movie. And I don't know. It's like I'm always torn. It's like, do I give it credit or do I condemn? And it's like I guess I try and do both, even though that often they seem to counteract each other.
I don't have any specific counters to that, but I would say that probably we are shortchanging the early 90s, because I do know that generally in representation we backslid from where we were in the 90s in terms of racial representation and diversity, and we're getting better at sexuality diversity and some gender diversity a little bit, but I still feel like, the 80s and 90s, there was some really thoughtful work going on. And, I think we don't give audiences and creators from that time period as much credit as we should, because we're like, it was old.
Yeah, and that's totally fair. Like I said, it's kind of a cop-out.
So I just had two quick kind of wrap-up-ish things. The first being, can we talk about the basement and how it's just like this labyrinth?
It's so big.
How is that even a place that exists? Like, does he own the entire
It feels like a set a little bit, but not an effective one.
My note is, how is this basement so huge? Although I have, it does play into, you kind of mentioned this with your Descent into Hell with Clarice and Hannibal, the idea of serial killers kind of having an underworld that they go to. Sometimes very literal, but there's the thing of there's compartmentalization that often happens or appears to happen with serial killers, like Jerry Brudos, the shoe fetish slayer. He's the one who kept all his kill equipment and some bodies in his garage, and he just kept the door locked and told his wife never to go in there, and she never went in there. And there are other things. There was I think his name is Joseph Callinger, dug a literal hole that he would go down into and do some interesting things with his feces. It's a weird story all around. But there's a lot of things. John Wayne Gacy literally burying the bodies of the boys that he murdered under his floorboards. Some of it's just, okay, you put bodies down in the ground, but some of it is this very, I hesitate to call it, Jungian collective unconscious thing, but this narrative of, you put the dark things away somewhere where you don't have to see them unless you choose to engage with them. That is both appealing to the killers and also appealing to the people who are telling stories about them. And, just like you mentioned, Clarice going down into hell to meet Hannibal, we see her going down into, James Gumm's upper floor of his house is a mess too, but it's nothing like downstairs. And it's also where he is, as far as you want to take it, he feels free to be himself. It's also where the tuck scene happens. It's where all the things where he has let down his guard happen, and it's his world. And it's filled with the specters of the women who have died before and all this stuff.
We don't get any mazes or anything, but I can't help but think of like a labyrinth with a minotaur a little bit too, especially when she's sort of lost down there. I don't know if that was going on or not, but I think of it.
Do you think he built? I got the sense that he built that hole, but it also looks like a really nice well. But I don't know why anyone would have put a house on top of a well.
I think the book explains something up. No, actually, I don't know that it explains it. There just was a well in the basement, I think, when he bought the house.
But I mean, that would imply
weird.
that he expanded his basement well beyond the boundaries of his house, because I don't think anyone builds a house on top of a well intentionally.
That's what I was thinking is like, and like, so seemingly his basement extends to underneath other people's houses that they don't know about or something. Because it was definitely like a labyrinth. While the lights are still on, every turn that she makes is like, decomposing body in a bathtub, like his actual suit that he's been crafting out of skin. Like, it's just like, like you were alluding to again. Yeah, this sort of like descent into hell.
It's a haunted house. Like, it's a Halloween going to the haunted house type of haunted house where, there are jump scares and everything else. Not exactly like a fictional haunted house.
That's the horror moment you were talking about. Is this a horror movie? There you go.
Yeah, I mean, this is her final girl segment where we see her, broken down and then finally triumphant. And if you or any of your listeners have watched the fantastic movie Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon, they give a great breakdown of what is symbolically going on during a final girls scene.
Wow, I haven't seen that one. Have you seen it?
Yeah, I haven't seen that either.
It's hilarious. It's a mockumentary of interviewing the next big Jason Voorhees. But one of the things he tells the interviewer is that the girl it seizes the villain's weapon and then glosses it as she's empowering herself with cock. Like,
okay.
But basically it's this idea that there's sort of a even in the final girl trope of horror, there's sort of a gender role twisting thing that tends to happen, which I think this plays on just enough, and that's it helps maintain a little bit of the horror feel after Hannibal is gone.
So
did you say you had one more thing, James?
Yeah, the last thing was I in my research I found that Jodie Foster had worked with the FBI, but so did Scott Glenn. There was a lot of FBI interaction, and apparently they'd been very closed off to sets before this and movies. But the set designer was allowed to go tour Quantico and actually see everything there, and was surprised at how bland everything was. Everything was very, and then Jonathan Demme was like, run with that, like make it bland, make it look boring in Quantico. And so I think the FBI, from what I understood from the reading that I was doing, is they were kind of wanting to and hoping to use this as a recruitment tool to get women to join the FBI.
I definitely considered it.
Yeah.
Yeah, for more than a hot second, yeah. And then I was like, no, I'm not that physically active. But interesting you mentioned that they got to go there, because I thought that this movie does a really good job of showing that Crawford's job is not particularly glamorous or particularly respected, which, by the late 80s, early 90s, it was getting there. But the BSU, the Behavioral Sciences Unit, was in the basement for a long time. Mm-hmm. No windows, cramped. They just shoved him in a corner and were like, sure, if this works, great. I mean, again, if you want to go watch the TV show Mindhunter, it goes into that in detail.
Yep.
Nowadays, if you go to a conference like Thriller Fest, at least when I was there was an FBI. She is a member of the FBI who is a cultural liaison, who was specifically there to give us her contact information so that if we depicted the FBI, we did it accurately. I still have her contact information somewhere.
But
it was
crazy. That's
wild, because it was this, and she gave me a little FBI sticker.
So this year we have been taking a final vote when we finish a project to determine whether or not we felt like the book or the movie was better. It's nothing definitive. It's just our opinions, and it's just for a little bit of fun discussion here at the end. So we're going to do that. I don't know, either James or I will start, and then we'll have you be the third and possibly tiebreaker. We'll see it plays out. And then take a moment to decide where you're leaning. You can kind of explain it if you want. But before we get to that, I actually want to point out a funny moment I caught this time. During the final credits, I watched Anthony Hopkins walk away. He does this really slow stroll as he's following Chilton for a really long time. I don't know if you noticed, but that scene goes on for like the entire credits. I am convinced that I saw his hat blow off at one point, and then I have to run after it and get it, put it back on, and then start doing the walk again. I'm pretty certain it's there.
Wow.
I thought it was a funny moment. So look for that next time you watch it.
I watched that whole scene too, and I guess I was just looking at the names more, but I was thinking like, damn, like somewhere out there, once they turn the corner, Anthony Hopkins is just hanging off, like he's just hanging out getting some craft services and stuff, like after he like walked out of the line of sight of the camera. That's funny though. I'll look for that hat blown off next time.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. I mean, unless it was somebody else, but I'm like, he was very far away, so it's hard to tell. And I had a big screen, so that helped a little bit. But yeah, I'm pretty sure. But anyway, do you want to start with your vote, James? Or you want to kick things off?
Yeah, honestly, I haven't thought that much about it. Should have before we started recording.
Should have.
I'm going to. I'm very tempted to go book. But just for cultural context and like sort of what it means to the zeitgeist and how iconic it is, I'm going to go movie. We have Anthony Hopkins and Jodie Foster with career-defining performances. Jonathan Demme basically doing the same career-defining performance. It's one of the most immaculately directed films that we've watched recently, for sure. I'm willing to say that, and it's so subtle in doing it as well. I don't think it's like very flashy necessarily, but the choices that are made. I think you can pause at any situation or any moment in either of any of the 4 interrogation scenes between Clarice and Hannibal, and you know where the character stands just from that pause screen. I'm sure you can tell like who's taken power, who's kind of got the edge in the conversation at that point. I think just in terms of like the filmmaking techniques, the blocking, the direction that was given to the actors, I think all in all that just makes for me picking the movie, and it edges out the book, even though I understand that it's nearly a screenplay. The book is basically the screenplay for the movie, and so like credit to where credit's due.
Absolutely, and I'm not going to belabor the point much, but it's the movie for me too, for all the reasons you said. It's also the thing I saw first, so I think it's near and dear to me in that way. But reading the book, I mentioned this last week, it really has shifted some of the respect. Like, I have a lot of respect for this movie, but it shifts a little bit because so much of it is on the page. So much of it is Thomas Harris, and I think you have to give him tons of credit for this story. And like you said, it's an extremely faithful adaptation, so if you like this story, like, you look back at the book, tons of credit where credit's due, like you said, but yeah, it's the movie, I think, for me. What about you, Caitlin?
Well, like I said, I haven't read the book since I was much younger.
Yeah, and you probably didn't know we were going to put you on the spot here, so I apologize for that.
That's also true, but I'm going to be contrarian and say the book just because I do like, and I remember really enjoying having the interiority of both Clarice and Hannibal, and some of the, I think you get some Chilton POV, if I recall correctly, like very briefly. I seem to recall that. Maybe just like briefly dipping into his head, but and I remember just really appreciating how detailed everything was. And again, it's that detail that they were able to pull through to the movie to make those, to make the intimacy work on screen, even though you can't see what's going on behind the scenes in their heads. I mean, we can see it because it's such a great movie.
I love it, and represent the book. You got to. Also, you probably love the 6 fingers of Hannibal Lecter in the book, right? I love it. So, wrapping up here, I just want to give our listeners a chance to, if they want to find you online, find out about your books, and if you have anything new coming out, let them know.
I do. I have 2 new things coming out. Yeah. On June 16th, I have an audio project coming out that's a tie-in for Vampire the Masquerade. You may have heard that there's a new video game and a new set of the core rule books coming out, or game is coming out, core books are out. It's a compilation, so it's 3 different authors, myself, Genevieve Gornichek, and Cassandra Kaw. We all wrote novellas that are very different and not at all linked, except that they're in the same world. They gave us a lot of free reign. The collection's called Walk Among Us, and my particular one is called The Land of Milk and Honey, which is about a vampire who is running an arts and farming commune in northern Portland, and right by the airport. And she's the community manager, and she really likes taking care of her sheep and her people. And then she falls in love with one of the people, and things go about as badly as you'd expect. And then the other thing coming out is a novella, this one in print and ebook, called Yellow Jessamine. It's a gothic horror novella of a woman who is extremely paranoid, and then her paranoia turns out to be right, but in the weirdest way possible. And that's coming out September 5th.
Awesome.
Yeah. You can find information on that. My website is CaitlinStarling.com. And my Twitter, which I am most active on, is CSEE_Starling.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining us, Caitlin. This has been a super fun conversation. I'm glad we finally got to have it. I feel like it's been long overdue.
Yeah, I'm so glad we got to do it.
Thanks again.
If you liked this episode, please let us know in the form of a rating and review on whatever podcast app you use. Super helpful to us, helps us get the word out, and we appreciate it very much.
If you wanted to help support the podcast in another way, we do have a Patreon. If you wanted to go check that out, it's patreon.com/inktofilm. And we have all kinds of tiers in there. It's everything from our bonus episodes that come out monthly all the way up to being able to influence what we're actually going to cover on the podcast. So there's a tier where you can get tokens and put it towards projects. And if you wanted to check that out, please go to patreon.com/inktofilm and help support what we're doing here.
Absolutely. We actually just released a new Patreon exclusive episode on the Return of the King animated film from the 1980s. That was quite a 80s movie clusterfuck. I don't know. It was something else, man. It was something else, and we had a fun conversation about it. So if that sounds interesting to you, definitely check out our Patreon. Also follow us on social media. We're at inktofilm on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And we have a Facebook group called the Council of Inklings where we post polls and we post news about adaptations. So join that as well if you're so inclined.
Thank you to Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music.
All right, we just want to thank Caitlin Starling one more time for being on the pod. It was a lot of fun having her on talking about Silence of the Lambs. Make sure to check out her book, The Luminous Dead, and the other new novellas that she announced. Check those out as well. Follow her on Twitter, all of the above. Oh, and we are going to be covering our next week's project is I Am Legend, the Richard Matheson book and film. We're going to combo it together into a single episode, so you can look forward to that if you're a fan. If you stuck around this long, you know what's coming next, so, good job.
Yeah, going to be an interesting project, to say the least. It's been a long time since I've seen that movie, so I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, guys, until next time.
Thanks for listening.